The night my son told me to leave, the rain was coming down so hard I could not see the end of the driveway. I stood on the front step, 68 years old, one hand on the railing and the other wrapped around the handle of a small suitcase, watching the water run in dark rivers across the pavement, while Nathan stood in the doorway with his eyes pointed somewhere just past my shoulder. Sandra stood behind him. Her arms were crossed. Her expression was the expression she always wore, composed, arranged entirely without seams. "You'll be fine," Nathan said. And then the door closed, and the sound it made was final, in the way that only certain sounds are the kind that you carry with you long after the moment has passed. I stood there in the rain for a long time. Not because I had nowhere to go, not because I was waiting for the door to open again. I stood there because some moments require stillness before the mind will accept them, and this one had not yet become real. I was 68 years old. I had a small suitcase. I had a name that no longer seemed to belong to any room in any house. My name is Miriam Calloway, and until a few months before that night, I believed I understood exactly what my life was. I was a wife for 46 years, a mother for over 4 decades, a woman who had arranged her days around family and quiet devotion, who knew which drawer held the extra batteries and which neighbor's horn barked at thunder, and which particular silence meant Gerard was working through something he had not yet found words for. I had built my life the way people build things when they expect them to last, carefully, steadily, from the inside out, without much thought for what would happen if the center could not hold. Gerard Calloway was not a man who sought attention. He owned a modest construction company in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of business that stayed deliberately small because he believed a man should only build as much as he could personally stand behind. He paid every bill on time. He repaired things before they failed. He made certain there was always enough, not excess, not abundance, just enough, the precise amount that never drew notice and never once came up short. We raised Nathan in a 2-story house on Dunbar Road with a sycamore tree at the edge of the yard and neighbors who lifted a hand every morning when they backed out of their driveways. It was not a perfect life, but it belonged to us, and the distance between those two things mattered more than I ever said out loud. When the cancer arrived, it did not arrive the way people imagine illness arrives, suddenly, dramatically, with the force of something that changes everything at once. It came the way winter comes to central Ohio, by degrees each day, slightly colder than the one before, until one morning you realize the ground has been frozen for weeks and you cannot remember exactly when it happened. There were months of treatment and second opinions in hospital corridors where the light was always too white and the coffee was always too weak, and the chairs in the waiting rooms were always positioned just slightly too close together. And then there were the final weeks when Gerard stopped going to the appointments and started spending his mornings in the bedroom chair by the window, watching the light cross the yard with the focused patience of a man committing something to memory. One evening, 4 days before he died, he asked me to come sit with him. I pulled a chair close to his and held his hand, which had grown lighter than I remembered, as though parts of him had already begun the process of leaving. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper, but it was still his voice, still the same voice that had said my name 10,000 times across 46 years. "Miriam," he said. I waited. "There's something I need you to remember." I tightened my hand around his. I had been fighting tears for days by then, and I was tired of fighting them, but I fought them anyway because he needed me present and not grieving, not yet. "If anything happens," he said slowly, "trust the blue card. Don't trust people over it." I looked at him. "What blue card?" He gave a small smile, the kind that had always meant he knew something I did not and was not yet ready to explain it. "You'll know when the time comes," he said. I thought it was the medication. Pain does things to a mind, loosens the connections between ideas, and lets them float in unfamiliar arrangements. I told myself this was one of those moments, a man who had lived carefully and precisely now, speaking in the language of discomfort and morphine. I squeezed his hand and told him I would remember even though I did not understand, and 2 nights later, he was gone. After the funeral, the house on Dunbar Road became a different kind of place. Every room held the shape of his absence. The floorboards announced themselves. The chair by the window sat empty in a way that seemed to take up more space than a chair ought to. I tried staying alone through those first weeks, telling myself I was a woman who had managed difficult things and could manage this too. But grief is not a problem to be managed. It is a weather system, and you cannot argue with weather. You can only decide whether to stay inside or walk out into it. Nathan began coming by more often during that period. He brought groceries and helped with small repairs and sat through dinners where the conversation had the careful quality of something assembled rather than natural. His wife Sandra came with him sometimes. She was always immaculate, always measured with a particular kind of warmth that was precise enough to feel practiced. She asked about Gerard in the way that people ask about someone they are curious about rather than someone they miss. And I answered her questions because I had no reason not to. "Mom, you shouldn't be out here alone," Nathan said one evening, standing at my kitchen counter with his jacket still on. "It's too much house for one person now." I did not want to leave. That house held every year of my marriage inside its walls, every argument and reconciliation, every birthday and ordinary Tuesday, every moment I had ever been fully myself. Leaving it felt like choosing to let all of that go. But loneliness has a patience that outlasts resistance, and eventually I gave in. I sold the house, packed 40 years into labeled boxes, and moved into Nathan and Sandra's home in a quieter subdivision outside the city. A newer house in a neighborhood where all the yards were the same size and the streetlights came on at exactly the same moment every evening. The first week felt hopeful in a way I did not yet know to distrust. Sandra had prepared the guest room with the kind of attention that suggested a magazine photograph rather than a lived-in house. Fresh linens, soft light, a small vase of white flowers on the nightstand. She stood in the doorway while I took it in and said, "We want you to feel at home here." And I looked around at everything she had arranged and believed her the way you believe something that has been presented without any visible reason for doubt. We had dinners together those first weeks. Nathan asked about my day, Sandra made tea in the evenings, and sat with me asking about the early years of my marriage, about how Gerard and I had met, about the house on Dunbar Road and the neighborhood and the people we had known. I told her things I had not spoken about in years, stories that lived in the part of memory that only opens when someone asks the right questions. She listened with complete attention, and I confused that listening for genuine interest, because I did not yet know the difference between a person who wants to know you and a person who wants to know what you have. 3 days after I moved in, I met Betty Pruitt. She appeared at the front door one afternoon with a covered plate and the unhurried confidence of a woman who had been presenting herself at other people's doors her entire adult life. She was in her late 60s with silver hair cut practically short and eyes that moved quickly and noticed everything. She introduced herself as living 3 houses down and said she had been meaning to come by since she saw the moving boxes. "I knew your husband," she said. "Not well, but enough to know he was decent, which is more than you can say for most people you meet." There was something in the plainness of it that I appreciated. Condolences so often came wrapped in softness that left you feeling gently smothered. Bet's words had the quality of a fact delivered without ceremony, and I found myself grateful for the difference. Sandra appeared in the hallway behind me, almost immediately drawn by the sound of voices at the door. She greeted Bet with a warmth that was perfectly calibrated. Offered coffee, stood in the kitchen doorway, while Bet and I talked present without fully joining attentive in a way I would not understand until much later. That evening, after Betty had gone, Sandra mentioned it in passing, her voice casual, and her back turned as she carried cups to the sink. "She seems sweet," she said, "but she talks, that one. Has a way of getting into things that aren't really her concern. I'd be careful about how much you share with her." I nodded. I thanked her for telling me. And for the weeks that followed, I kept a small, careful distance from Bet Pruitt because I had been told to, and I had not yet learned to question who was giving me instructions or why. The changes in my daily life came the way the cancer had come, slowly enough that each individual moment seemed unremarkable. It started with the mail. "Let me sort through that for you," Sandra said one afternoon, lifting the stack cleanly from my hands. "You shouldn't have to deal with all of it." This seemed considerate. I thanked her. Then came the finances. One morning over coffee, she said that Nathan had mentioned I received a pension, and wouldn't it be simpler if they helped manage the household bills together just to keep things organized and reduce my burden? This also sounded reasonable. I had lived for 46 years with a man who handled financial matters carefully and asked nothing of me beyond trust, and I had given that trust without reservation because it had always been warranted. I extended it again now without thinking because that was what I knew how to do. But the bank statements stopped coming. The pension notices I used to receive by mail simply stopped arriving. When I mentioned this to Sandra, she told me without hesitation that they had switched everything to paperless. It's all digital now, she said pleasantly. Would you like me to pull it up for you? I said yes. Of course, she said. I'll do that later today. She never did. One afternoon, I found Nathan alone in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his phone. I sat across from him and asked as directly as I could manage whether he knew anything about why I had not received any account information in several weeks. He looked up briefly from his screen. She handles all of that now, he said, meaning Sandra. She's better at it than I am. He said it without concern, the way you say something that has been settled so long, it no longer requires thought. I sat with those words after he left the room. Gerard had managed our finances for 46 years. He had never used the phrase better at it to describe their arrangement. He had simply done it because he believed it was his responsibility, because he was careful about responsibilities. The idea that this careful architecture could simply be transferred without discussion, without my participation to a woman I had known for a matter of weeks, felt wrong in a way I could not yet articulate clearly. The situation in the house continued to change in small ways that accumulated. I noticed I was no longer invited into certain conversations that happened in the kitchen after dinner. When the phone rang in the evenings, Sandra answered before anyone else could reach it. Packages and letters that arrived addressed to me were gathered by her and placed in a pile she said she would give me later, and sometimes she did, and sometimes she did not. When I asked about specific pieces of correspondence, she always had an answer prepared, never detailed enough to actually answer the question, but delivered with enough smoothness that pushing further felt impolite. There were comments, too subtle ones, the kind that took a moment to feel their full weight after they had already landed. You should rest more, Miriam. Let us worry about these things. You've been through so much. Each comment arrived wrapped in concern, but concern and management are not the same thing. And something in me was beginning to understand the difference, even when the rest of me was still trying to believe otherwise. 6 weeks after I moved in, Sandra came to my bedroom door one evening and suggested in the measured tone she used for things she had already decided that I might be more comfortable in the room downstairs. It was smaller, but on a single level, she explained. Easier, safer. I would not have to think about the stairs. I have been using stairs for 68 years, I said. She smiled. It was not an unkind smile, but it was not a warm one either. And you've done so many things for so many years, she said. But circumstances change. We want you to be safe. Nathan stood behind her in the hallway. He said nothing. I watched him not say anything and understood that his silence was not uncertainty about what he thought. It was agreement with what had already been decided. I moved downstairs the following morning into a room that was smaller and darker and positioned at the back of the house in the way that rooms are positioned when the goal is not comfort, but invisibility. It was in that room approximately 3 weeks later that I found the blue card. I was going through a bag I had not opened since the move, searching for something I needed, reaching into the lining of an old purse I had not carried since Gerard's funeral. My fingers found something flat and smooth tucked into the inner seam of the pocket. I pulled it out and held it under the lamp. A small card, navy blue, worn at the edges from years of being carried and forgotten and carried again. No logo, no bank name, nothing printed on it except a faint metallic strip along one edge that caught the light when I tilted it. I sat on the edge of the bed and held it in both hands and heard his voice as clearly as if he had simply stepped into the room behind me. Trust the blue card. Don't trust people over it. I held the card for a long time without moving. The room was dim and quiet and entirely separate from the rest of the house, which was exactly how it had been designed. I thought about the words again. Not the medication talking. Not a man confused by pain and proximity to dying. A man who had known exactly what he was saying and had chosen those words with the same precision he brought to everything else in his life. Late that same night, I was crossing the kitchen on my way back from the bathroom when I heard Sandra's voice from the living room, low and careful, the register a person uses when they believe they are not being heard. We just need the paperwork sorted, she was saying. Once she signs it, everything moves cleanly. A pause. She doesn't understand the details. That's the whole point. I stood in the dark hallway with my hand flat against the wall and my heart beating in my ears. I waited until the voice stopped. Then I went back to my room and lay down on top of the covers fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself I had misunderstood, that there was another explanation, that the words meant something other than what they sounded like. I spent 2 days trying to believe that. Then I found the documents. I was in the kitchen before sunrise, earlier than my usual time, when I noticed a stack of papers sitting on the counter near the fruit bowl, partially covered by a folder that had not been pressed closed all the way. A corner of the top page was visible with my name printed on it. I told myself I was not prying. I told myself I was simply straightening something that had been left out carelessly. My hands began to shake before I had finished the second sentence. The language was legal and dense, the kind of language designed to be navigated rather than read, full of phrases like authority of attorney, in financial administration, involuntary transfer of control. At the bottom of the third page, there was a signature block with my name typed beneath the line. The signature above it was not mine. It was not even a careful attempt. It was the signature of someone who had practiced a version of my name until it looked plausible from a distance, but fell apart under any real attention. I heard footsteps from the hallway and placed everything back exactly as I had found it and moved to the far side of the kitchen. Sandra came in 30 seconds later. She looked at me, and her expression did not change at all. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. She poured coffee and stood at the counter looking at her phone. I watched her and thought about Gerard in the chair by the window in those final weeks, watching the yard with that particular focused attention. He had seen something coming that I had not. He had understood something about what was happening around him that I was only now beginning to understand. And he had not warned me with words because he had known that words alone would not have been enough. That same afternoon, I tried one more time with Nathan. I sat across from him at the kitchen table and asked him directly calmly to explain why I had received no pension correspondence in over a month. He set his phone down. He looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was not confusion or concern or surprise. It was something quieter and worse. Recognition. The look of a person who has been asked a question they knew was coming and had already prepared themselves for. "Mom," he said, "we're doing what's best for you. You need to let us handle things." He said it without anger, without cruelty. He said it with the steady confidence of someone who has repeated a thing enough times that it has stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a fact. And in the moment he said it, something in me that had been straining against the weight of the past months simply gave way. Not in despair, in clarity, because I understood now that he was not following Sandra without knowing what he was following. He knew, he had been knowing for some time, and he had chosen it anyway every single morning deliberately. That was the night I stopped waiting for something to change on its own. I packed what I needed after midnight, moving quietly through the small, dark room, choosing only what was essential. A few days of clothing, my identification, and the documents I had arrived with. The small framed photograph of Gerard and me from the first year of our marriage, standing in front of an old car in a parking lot somewhere, both of us squinting into afternoon sun. And the blue card, which I tucked into the inside pocket of my coat, pressed flat against my chest where I could feel it. I left before first light. The driveway was empty. The air was cold and carrying the kind of stillness that only exists in the hour before the world begins its noise. I walked down the front path with my suitcase rolling behind me, each step placed deliberately with a quality of intention I had not felt in a very long time. At the end of the block, I passed Betty Pruitt's house. A light was already on in her kitchen. Through the window, I could see her moving around inside with the unhurried ease of someone comfortable in their own home. She did not see me. I did not stop. But as I turned the corner and the subdivision fell away behind me, I made a quiet private promise to myself. Whatever the blue card led to, whatever Gerard had seen and planned and kept between himself and the future he knew was coming, I was going to follow it. Not because it was the only option available to me, but because he had spent his final years making sure I had at least one option that was entirely mine. And I had already waited far too long to use it. The motel occupied a strip of commercial road on the outer edge of the city, the kind of building that had existed in that particular location for decades, without attracting much attention. The room held a bed, a desk, a window that looked out on the parking lot, and a bathroom that smelled of industrial soap. It was the first space in months that no one else had any claim over. And I sat on the edge of the bed in my coat with the blue card in my hand and understood that specific kind of ownership, right? the way you understand something that has been taken from you and then returned. I had been in the room less than an hour when I heard a door close somewhere in the hallway, followed by the particular sound of a suitcase rolling across flooring. I opened my door. A woman stood in the corridor, slightly older than me, with white hair pulled back neatly, and the careful, economical movements of someone who had learned to manage physical discomfort without calling attention to it. Her suitcase was nearly identical to mine in size, the kind that holds only what is strictly necessary. We looked at each other without speaking for a moment, in the way that people look at each other when they recognize something they have not yet put into words. Irene Weston, she said. Miriam Calloway. She looked at my suitcase, then back at my face. First name. Yes, I said. Yours. Third. She said it without apology or embarrassment, and I liked her immediately for that economy. We ended up in the narrow lobby area near the vending machines, each of us with a cup of something approximating coffee, and she told me her story in the plain language of a woman who had told it enough times to have stripped away everything that was not essential. Her husband had died 14 months earlier. A nephew she had trusted completely had transferred her savings in increments too small to trigger her attention until there was almost nothing left to trigger attention over. I signed everything he put in front of me, she said. I thought that was what you did when someone who loved you offered to help. She looked down at her cup. The gap between you and me is probably smaller than you think. I thought about the blue card against my chest. A few inches, I said. She looked at me for a moment and then gave a short, quiet laugh, the kind that does not mean anything is funny, but means a person has recognized something true, even though it costs them something to recognize it. They had taken different things from each of us, she and I, but they had used the same method. The same slow removal of agency dressed in the language of care. The same patient accumulation of control over small things until the small things added up to everything. I thought about that as I finished my coffee and said goodnight, and I thought about it again as I lay in the motel bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the building settling around me. The weeks before Gerard's diagnosis had a quality I recognized only in retrospect, a particular sharpening of his attention to certain things. He began asking me questions I had not thought to find unusual at the time. Where did I keep the pension paperwork? Had I ever looked at the account statements on my own? Did I know which institution held our savings and what the procedures were for accessing them alone? I had answered each question without curiosity, because Gerard was meticulous and the questions seemed consistent with his general approach to being prepared. I had not understood that he was running a different kind of inventory, that the questions were not about whether I could access things in ordinary circumstances, but about whether I would be able to access them in the specific, extraordinary circumstances he was beginning to see approaching on the horizon. He had always been the kind of man who fixed things before they broke, who checked the smoke detector batteries twice a year, who kept the cars serviced and the gutters cleared and the insurance policies in a labeled folder in the filing cabinet. What he did in those final months was simply an extension of the same instinct applied to a threat he could not name out loud to me without changing something irreparably between us. He protected me by not telling me he was protecting me, which was the most Gerard thing he could possibly have done, and which I loved him for, even as I had spent years not knowing it was happening. I thought about this in the motel room, the night after I visited the bank, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, with the investigative file open across my knees and the letter folded carefully on the pillow beside me. The building was quiet. The parking lot outside the window held a handful of cars and a streetlight that flickered slightly in the wind. I had eaten something from a vending machine and had not tasted any of it, which seemed appropriate given everything else that was happening. My mind was moving through what I had learned in the order I had learned it, trying to organize it into a shape I could use. $7 million. The number still felt improbable, the kind of number that belongs to a different category of person entirely. But Gerard had been building the company for 30 years quietly and carefully, staying small on purpose, but never spending more than he needed to and always reinvesting what came back. He had owned a piece of land outside Columbus that had appreciated significantly over 2 decades. He had been careful with every dollar in a way that I had trusted completely and had therefore never examined. And he had apparently been hiding nothing from me except the scale of what the carefulness had accumulated, because he had understood that the scale was also a danger and that the danger was not abstract. The emails in Stacker's file were clinical and specific and entirely without sentiment. Sandra had not written to her legal contact as a worried daughter-in-law. She had written as someone managing a project. The questions about establishing cognitive decline were not exploratory. They were confirmatory. She had already understood the mechanics of guardianship and was clarifying particular procedural points. The way a person clarifies the terms of a contract they have already read and mostly understood. She had known what she wanted and was determining the most efficient path to it. What I could not fully account for sitting in that motel room with the file open across my knees was Nathan. The emails were Sandra's. The meetings with the legal consultant were Sandra's. The inquiry to the bank had been Nathan's, but the signatures on the documentation he submitted were not his, which meant someone had prepared that documentation and given it to him to present. Had he known the signatures were not his own, had he known what he was presenting was forged, or had he simply carried an envelope given to him by his wife and assumed that whatever was inside it was legitimate? I did not know the answer, and I found that not knowing was somehow worse than either answer would have been. A man who had done this knowingly was one thing. A man who had done it without examining what he was doing, who had allowed himself not to look too closely at things he was carrying out, for someone else was something more complicated and more painful to hold in mind. Because that man had once been a boy who brought me wildflowers from the yard and told me they were special because he had picked them himself, and the distance between those two versions of the same person was a distance I could not measure from where I was sitting. I closed the file and set it on the desk and turned off the bedside lamp and lay in the dark listening to the wind push at the window of the motel room. Tomorrow I would call Roy Stacker. Tomorrow I would call Harriet Bloom. Tomorrow I would begin the part where I stopped being the subject of other people's plans and became again the author of my own. In the morning I found the nearest bank branch on my phone, a small institution 3 miles from the motel, the kind of building that had not been updated since the early 90s and still had real tellers behind a real counter. I drove there slowly, my hands relaxed on the wheel, setting aside every possible outcome and every fear and every imagined version of what I might find. Because Gerard had prepared something, and the only way to understand what it was required me to walk through a door and trust that he had known what he was doing. The young teller who took the blue card and ran it through her terminal had the careful professionalism of someone still learning how to remain composed when the unexpected appears in a routine situation. When the card registered, something crossed her face that she did not quite manage to smooth away. She excused herself and walked quickly to a glass-walled office at the back of the bank, and I watched through the window as she showed the screen to the man inside who looked at the card, looked at the screen, and then became very still in the way people become still when they are recalibrating something fundamental. The branch manager came out of his office with the measured pace of someone trying not to appear to be hurrying. He was in his mid-50s, well-dressed, with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades handling sensitive situations without amplifying them unnecessarily. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, the fact that he already had my name meant the card had already told him something significant. "I'm Douglas Fenn. Would you come with me for a moment?" In his office, the door closed. He sat across the desk from me and looked at the card, and then at the monitor, and then back at me with the expression of a person who is about to say something they want to say with appropriate care. "Where did you get this card?" "My husband," I said. "Gerard Calloway." Something shifted in his expression. "I see," he said. He turned the monitor toward me. The numbers on the screen were large enough that my eyes passed over them the first time without registering them correctly. I looked again. My mind refused them and then slowly accepted them. $7,200,000 and change. "That cannot be right," I said, though even as the words left me, I already knew that it was. Douglas Fenn did not smile. He said, "It is. And Mrs. Calloway, this account has been waiting for you for some time. There have also been attempts to access it. More than one attempt." I looked up from the numbers on the screen. He opened a folder on his desk. "Approximately 9 weeks after your husband's passing, a man identifying himself as Nathan Calloway contacted this institution requesting information about any accounts associated with Gerard Calloway." He turned a page. He was told that no information could be released without direct authorization from the account holder. He returned twice more with additional documentation attempting to establish himself as a legal beneficiary of the estate. He slid a copy across the desk toward me. Our legal team reviewed the signatures on the submitted documents. They did not match verified records. The requests were denied and a fraud flag was placed on the account. I looked at the copy. The signature, claiming to be Nathan's, was close. Close enough that someone moving quickly through a stack of documents might not notice. But wrong in the way practice things are wrong, technically plausible and emotionally false. His wife came with him on the second visit, Fenn continued. She identified herself and argued that as his legal spouse, she should have access to information about family estate accounts. Our legal team denied that request as well. I sat with this for a moment. Is there a letter? I asked. He looked at me carefully. Yes, he said. He reached into the folder and produced a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Gerard's handwriting, the same slight downward slant at the ends of lines that I had noticed in the first year of our marriage and had never once mentioned, because it seemed like the kind of thing a person should be allowed to have without comment. I held the envelope for a long moment before opening it. His handwriting was unchanged, and seeing it on paper prepared by a man who had known he was running out of time made everything in my chest constrict in a way I had not anticipated, even knowing what was in that office. The letter began with my name and went directly to the truth, because Gerard had never been a man for unnecessary preamble. He wrote that he had noticed things in the months before his diagnosis that he had not fully understood at first. Questions about finances asked in passing during family visits that seemed too specific for casual curiosity. An interest in the details of the business and what the estate would look like that carried a particular quality he had learned over decades to recognize as the difference between genuine care and something more calculated. He wrote that he had not told me because he was not certain, and because he was sick, and because he did not want to hand me a fear that might come to nothing while I was already caring so much. He wrote that instead he had acted. He had established the trust 3 years before his death, arranging it so that only my physical presence and the blue card together could unlock access, making it structurally impossible for anyone to claim it on my behalf or in my name without my actual direct involvement. He had retained a private investigator named Roy Stacker 18 months before his diagnosis, and Stacker had continued working after Gerard's death because the arrangement had been funded and structured to outlast him. He wrote that everything Stacker had documented was accessible through the account, and that he had also arranged for legal representation through an attorney named Harriet Bloom, whose contact information was included in the trust documents. Then he wrote the part that came apart inside me. He wrote that he had always known I believed the best in people, that it was one of the things he had loved most about me from the very beginning, and that it also meant I sometimes did not see what was approaching until it was very close. He wrote that he had known this about me and had loved me anyway and had planned accordingly. He wrote that I did not owe anyone my peace, not even family, especially not family that had forgotten what it meant to love me properly. I set the letter down on the desk and sat with it open in front of me for a long time without moving. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of the bank conducting its ordinary business on the other side of the closed door. I thought about all the evenings I had sat at the table in Nathan and Sandra's house, thanking them for their help, feeling grateful for their presence, shrinking myself a little further each day into the space they were willing to allow me. And I thought about Gerard in his chair by the window, watching the yard with that focused, deliberate patience. He had been watching something else too, something inside the house that I had not been watching because I had not thought to look. He had been protecting me while he was dying. The weight of that was almost more than I could hold in a single moment. I asked Douglas Fenn for the rest of what the account contained, and he provided it without hesitation. Roy Stacker's investigative file was organized chronologically and without editorial commentary, the way evidence is assembled when it is meant to speak for itself rather than persuade. There were photographs. Nathan and Sandra at a restaurant leaning over a table together, the image time-stamped 1 week after Gerard's initial diagnosis. Printed email exchanges between Sandra and a legal consulting firm in which she asked, in precise and practical language, how quickly a finding of cognitive decline could be established in a person of advanced age, what kind of medical documentation would be required to support such a finding, and whether financial authority could be transferred ahead of any full guardianship determination. Each question was specific. Each question had been written by someone who already understood the process and was looking for confirmation of its mechanics rather than an explanation of them. This was not a daughter-in-law exploring options out of vague worry. This was a woman who had identified a sequence of steps and was moving through them methodically. And then I found a name I recognized from a different context entirely. Dr. Conrad Parsley appeared in 2 of the meeting records. Stacker had documented a physician listed as present at consultations and between Sandra and her legal contact. The same Dr. Conrad Parsley for whom Sandra had scheduled me a routine checkup. Something to make sure you're adjusting well, she had said. I'll come with you so you don't have to deal with the parking. I sat with that for a long moment. I had been within 1 phone call of sitting in that office, of submitting to an evaluation conducted by a man who had already been brought into a plan long before my name was ever mentioned to him as a patient. From the motel that evening, I called the doctor's office. I gave my name as the scheduled patient and asked who had made the appointment on my behalf. The receptionist confirmed it had been my daughter-in-law. I asked what medical history about me had been provided ahead of the visit. The receptionist's voice changed in the way voices change when a question has revealed something the speaker was not prepared to navigate. She said she would need to look into that and call me back. She did not call me back. I called the number in the trust documents for Roy Stacker. He answered on the second ring, gave only his last name, and waited. My name is Miriam Calloway, I said. I believe you knew my husband. I've been expecting this call, he said without any quality of performance in his voice. He told me you'd reach out when you were ready to move. I have the file, I said. Good. What do you want to do with it? I had been thinking about this since I left the bank, not emotionally, but practically the way Gerard would have approached the same question. I want to know what they're planning now, I said. Not the history, the next steps. That's the right question, Stacker said. He had the direct, abbreviated manner of someone who spent his professional life around people who talked too much and had adjusted accordingly. We spoke for just under 20 minutes. He told me that since I had left the house, activity had increased significantly. More phone calls, more contact with legal offices, an inquiry to a real estate agent about comparative property values in the neighborhood. My absence had not slowed them. It had accelerated them. They believed that without me present to notice or object, the path forward had cleared. There's one more thing you should know, Stacker said near the end of the call. Your neighbor, Bet Pruitt. Sandra has contacted her twice since you left. I believe she's being positioned as a character witness. I closed my eyes briefly. Bet, who had appeared at the door with a covered plate and said Gerard was decent, which is more than you can say for most. Bet, who had looked at my suitcase with honest concern the morning I walked past her house. Bet, who had been standing in the middle of this situation the entire time without knowing she was standing in the middle of anything at all. Understood, I said. Harriet Bloom had offices in a building that smelled of old carpeting and institutional coffee, and the particular kind of legal seriousness that comes from decades of dealing with situations that people would have preferred not to be in. She met me in a conference room with a long table and windows that looked out on a parking garage and asked me to tell her everything from the beginning without interruption in the order it had happened. I told her. She listened without writing anything down, which I found unnerving until I understood that she was the kind of person who listened so precisely that she did not need to write things down in order to remember them. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the folder I had brought from the bank and read through it with the focused efficiency of someone who had read many such documents and knew exactly where the significant details would be located. This is thorough, she said. Your husband was thorough. He was, I said, in everything. She set the folder down and looked at me directly. I want to be clear about what we're dealing with, she said. This is not a family that got confused about boundaries. This is a family, or at least one member of it, who identified a target and moved toward it systematically. The guardianship petition is not a panicked response to your disappearance. It was already in motion before you left. Your leaving simply accelerated the timeline. I understood that, I said. What I need you to understand, she said, is that the strength of the evidence matters less than how it's presented. We have documentation that would be compelling in any fair proceeding. But guardianship courts are often sympathetic to families expressing concern even when that concern turns out to be manufactured. We need to stay ahead of the narrative. We need to make sure that what the court sees first is the truth, not the version they have constructed. She had a quality of calm that I found myself leaning on even in that first meeting. Not warmth exactly, but competence so complete that it radiated a kind of steadiness. I had spent months in a house where the calm of the woman in charge of things was a warning sign. Harriet's calm was different. It was the calm of someone who had looked at difficult situations for a long time and had learned that panic never served any useful purpose. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask it. What do you want the outcome to be? Not legally, personally. What do you want to happen to your son? I thought about that for a long moment. I want him to understand what he did, I said finally. I want there to be consequences that reflect that, but I don't want to destroy him. She nodded. Those goals are not in conflict, she said. The legal process will create consequences regardless of what you want. What you have some influence over is what comes after. What comes after, I repeated. He is going to need to make choices about who he is going to be, she said. That's not something you can do for him, but you can decide how much space you're willing to hold open for the possibility that he makes different choices than he's been making. I thought about the boy who brought wildflowers, about the silence in the hallway the night Sandra decided I should live in the back room, about the look in his eyes when he said, "We're doing what's best for you," with the steady confidence of a man who had told himself this often enough that he had come to believe it. "I'm not ready to close any doors yet," I said. Harriet looked at me for a moment. "Good," she said. "That's a reasonable place to start." The petition for emergency guardianship arrived through the office of Harriet Bloom 4 days after my visit to the bank. Nathan and Sandra were petitioning on grounds of cognitive decline. They had submitted documentation from two sources, a preliminary assessment letter from Dr. Conrad Parsley and a written statement from a neighbor who described me as having appeared disoriented and forgetful on multiple occasions over the preceding months. The neighbor was Bet Pruitt. I read her statement in Harriet Bloom's office, while the attorney read the same document across the desk from me. Betty had described two specific incidents an afternoon when I had apparently asked her the same question twice within a short interval, and a morning when she had observed me standing in the driveway, appearing uncertain about which direction I intended to walk. Both incidents were described with the careful, mild language of a person who believed she was helping someone she cared about, who had no idea her words were being assembled into something they had never been intended to build. Harriet set the papers down and looked at me. She was in her 60s, compact and precise, with the particular calm of someone who had spent decades in rooms where emotions ran high and had learned that calm was always the most effective tool available. "They're trying to establish a narrative before you have standing to contest it," she said. "If they can get temporary guardianship approved even for 30 days, they have access to everything during that window." "The medical portion came from Parsley," I said. "Yes, and Parsley has a documented history." She turned to a specific page in the file. "A conflict of interest complaint 5 years ago in a similar case. Not a criminal finding, but on record. Enough to challenge the credibility of any assessment he provides." She paused. "What about the neighbor?" I thought about the plate of lemon bars, about the plainness of her condolence, about the morning I had walked past her kitchen window and she had been moving around inside it with the ease of someone entirely at peace in their own life. "She was used," I said. "She didn't know what she was contributing to." I met Bet at a coffee shop 2 towns from the neighborhood, a place neither of us had any reason to frequent. She arrived looking exactly like herself. Silver-haired, direct, slightly out of breath from the walk from the parking lot. She sat across from me and said my name with a quality of relief that was unmistakable. "Miriam, I didn't know where you had gone. I was genuinely worried." "I know," I said. I placed the documents on the table between us, organized so the most significant pieces came first. She read in silence. I watched her face move through several expressions before settling into something still and serious. She found her own name near the top of the third page. She read the paragraph slowly, then read it again. "She called me," Bet said. Her voice had gone quiet twice. "She asked what we talked about when we had coffee. She said she was worried about you. She was so calm about it, so genuinely concerned sounding." She looked up. "She told me you'd been having episodes, that you were forgetting things, that the family was worried you weren't safe alone." "She is always calm," I said. Bet looked back down at the page. "She asked me once whether Gerard ever mentioned any accounts she didn't know about, any financial arrangements he hadn't told the family about." She paused. I told her I had no idea what Gerard's finances looked like. I thought it was an odd question, but I didn't understand why she was asking it. She pressed her palms flat on the table. She was looking for it. Before you even knew it existed, she was already looking for it. "Yes," I said. Bet folded her hands and sat quietly for a moment. Then she said with the particular resolve of a woman who has just understood precisely how she has been used and intends to respond to that understanding with action, "What do you need from me?" "Tell the truth," I said. Exactly what she asked you, exactly how you answered, and exactly what you understood about why she was asking. She nodded. Then she said something I had not expected. She asked if I remembered in the second week after I had moved into Nathan and Sandra's home, a morning when Gerard had come to find her. Not Nathan. Gerard himself some months before he was too ill to drive. He had knocked on her door and asked if she had a few minutes. He asked me to look after you, Bet said. If things ever got complicated, he said she's stronger than she knows. She just needs someone to remind her sometimes. I sat with that. The room around us continued its ordinary business, cups clinking, a low murmur of other people's conversations, the sound of a door opening and closing. Gerard had come to Betty Pruitt's door, had sat across from her in her kitchen, had said those words and then driven home and never mentioned any of it to me. He had been building the net from every direction he could reach. Tell me when and where, Bet said. The evening that Roy Stacker confirmed Sandra had made a significant financial transfer moving funds just below the automatic reporting threshold, I was sitting in the motel room going through the investigative file again. The transfer told me something precise and important. She believed the situation was contracting around her. People in contracting situations either stop moving or they accelerate past the point of caution. Sandra was not the kind of person who stopped. My phone rang at 17 minutes past 10, an unknown number. I answered. Mrs. Calloway. The voice was male and measured but carried an underlying quality of unsteadiness, the particular sound of a person doing something they have argued themselves into against their better instincts. My name is Conrad Parsley. I said nothing. I waited. I need you to understand something about how I came to be involved in this, he said. I was approached as a consultant. The situation was described to me as a straightforward family wellness evaluation for an elderly woman whose family had concerns about her ability to manage independently. I was not told about the legal proceedings attached to that evaluation. He paused. I was not told that my assessment was intended to be submitted as evidence in a guardianship petition. I see, I said. I'm withdrawing my involvement. In writing effective today. Another pause. I also think you should know that the person who approached me is not going to stop on her own. She is very focused, Mrs. Calloway. She will keep moving unless something external stops her. The line was quiet between us for a moment. Thank you for telling me, I said. I set the phone down on the desk next to the blue card and sat looking at them both. Outside the window, the rain had started again, steady and unhurried, the kind of October rain that does not make a dramatic entrance but simply arrives and continues indefinitely. I thought about Gerard by the bedroom window in those final weeks, watching the yard with such focused and deliberate attention. He had not been afraid. I understood that with more clarity now than I ever had before. He had been methodical. He had been building things even as everything else was being taken from him. And he had trusted me to use what he had built when the moment came. Tomorrow was the moment. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, not in its physical dimensions, but in the distance it placed between me and everything that had brought me there. All of it, the weeks in that back room, the phone call overheard in the dark hallway, the documents with my name forged at the bottom, the slow, careful removal of my own life from my own hands. It was all present in that room with me, compressed into folders and binders on the table in front of Harriet Bloom. I sat beside her with my hands folded in my lap and looked at the judge's bench and did not look away. Roy Stacker sat 3 rows behind me. I did not turn to acknowledge him, but knowing he was there steadied something in the center of my chest. Nathan arrived alone. That was the first thing I noticed. Not Sandra's absence specifically, but the quality of the space beside him, which was simply empty in a way that changed his entire bearing. He stood with a diminished certainty, as though the gravitational center he had been orienting himself around for years had been removed and he had not yet found his own. He looked at me when he came in. He did not immediately look away. That was new. Sandra's attorney presented her case without her. A prior commitment, he explained without elaborating. Harriet did not respond to this explanation, which itself communicated something to anyone paying attention. The attorney described a family motivated by genuine concern, a son and daughter-in-law who had welcomed an aging parent into their home and observed changes that worried them. He used words like disoriented and safety risk and capacity concerns. He submitted the letter from Dr. Parsley, 2 pages of clinical language calibrated to suggest progressive cognitive decline, without making any specific claim that could be directly refuted by a single piece of counter evidence. I sat still throughout all of it. I had prepared for this moment not just legally, but in the deeper interior way, and I was not going to let it move me before it was my turn. When Harriet stood, she did not hurry. "Your Honor," she said, "what we are witnessing here is not a family acting out of concern. What we are witnessing is a coordinated plan." She presented the documents in sequence. The records of unauthorized access attempts at the bank, each one detailed and dated over a period of months. The email exchanges between Sandra and her legal consulting contact with their specific and damning questions about the mechanics of establishing cognitive decline in a healthy adult. The financial transfer logs showing money moved from accounts Nathan had access to in amounts carefully calibrated to avoid triggering mandatory reporting requirements. The medical assessment submitted by the petitioners, Harriet continued, was provided by a physician who has since submitted a written withdrawal of his involvement, citing his discovery that the evaluation was not the straightforward family wellness consultation it was represented to be when he was first approached. She submitted the withdrawal letter as a supplemental exhibit. Furthermore, we have submitted the results of a full cognitive evaluation conducted by a court-appointed specialist over the past 3 days. The results indicate no impairment of any kind in the respondent. Sandra's attorney shifted in his chair. The witness statement submitted by the petitioners, Harriet went on, was obtained from a neighbor who, upon reviewing the documentation we are presenting today, provided a revised account of her interactions with the petitioner's wife and has agreed to testify for the respondent. She let that settle. We have records showing who initiated contact with this neighbor, what questions were asked across multiple conversations, and over what period of time. The documentation makes clear that this neighbor was used as an intelligence source without her knowledge or consent and was not a willing participant in the construction of a false narrative about the respondent. Sandra's attorney objected that the neighbor's revised statement constituted coach testimony. Harriet responded without raising her voice or adjusting her posture in any way. Coaching, she said, involves telling a witness what to say, showing someone documentation of how their words have been used without their knowledge, and allowing them to draw their own conclusions from that documentation is something else entirely. She paused. We have records showing the direction in which contact flowed between Mrs. Sandra Calloway and the neighbor in question, beginning well before any legitimate concern about the respondent's cognition was ever raised. Those records are in the supplemental exhibits. The judge reviewed several pages without comment. The attorney requested a brief recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, I sat at the table and watched Nathan across the room. He was looking at the documents Harriet had entered into evidence, his eyes moving through them with the careful attention of a person reading something they already knew, but had been hoping not to have to face in a room full of other people. Whatever he was feeling, it was visible now in a way it had not been before. The composed, managed quality he usually wore had come apart, and what was underneath it was something more complicated and more human. When we reconvened, the attorney indicated that his client had elected not to contest the primary findings. The petition for emergency guardianship was withdrawn. The judge looked at the folder in front of him without any visible expression of surprise. Given the evidence presented and the withdrawal of the petition, this court finds no basis for guardianship or any limitation on the legal authority of Mrs. Miriam Calloway over her own affairs and estate. He turned to another section of the file. The private trust established by Gerard Calloway is confirmed to be under the full and exclusive control of the named beneficiary. He paused. The financial irregularities documented in these proceedings are referred for review by the appropriate investigative authorities. He closed the folder. That was the formal end of it. I had expected to feel something large and conclusive in that moment, the way resolutions feel in the versions of stories we tell ourselves, complete and appropriately weighted. What I felt instead was quieter and more complicated. A settling the way a structure settles after it has been strained by something larger than it was designed to bear, returning slowly to its own proportions. Harriet put her hand briefly on my arm. "That's the first step," she said quietly. Nathan was waiting outside the courtroom doors. He was not positioned to block my path. He stood to one side with his hands at his sides, the posture of a person who has decided to be present and available, but is not going to press any claim on what comes of it. I stopped. "Mom," he said. I waited. "I have something I need to say." He looked at the floor for a moment and then looked back at me directly. "Not because it repairs anything. I understand it doesn't repair anything. He paused to collect himself. I knew what was happening, not every detail, not from the very beginning, but I knew when things had gone past a line they should not have crossed. I kept making reasons for myself. I kept telling myself she was right, that you needed managing, that what we were doing was actually responsible. Another pause. The truth is it was easier than standing up to her, and I chose easier over and over for months. I looked at my son, not at the child he had been, not at the version of him I had been carrying out of habit and love, but at the man in front of me who was saying something true and who understood it was too late and was saying it anyway because that was the only honest thing he had left to offer. What would you have done, I said, if the car did not work? He was quiet long enough that the silence itself became an answer. I don't know, he said finally. That's what I have to figure out how to live with. I nodded, not in forgiveness and not in dismissal, but in plain acknowledgement of something that had been said without evasion. It was the most honest thing he had offered me in longer than I could precisely identify. Sandra found me in the parking lot of Harriet's building 2 hours after the hearing ended. I heard her heels on the pavement before I turned, and when I did, she was closer than I had expected, her expression still carrying its familiar composure but with something additional beneath it. Now a tightness, the look of a person who has run several calculations and arrived at a result they did not anticipate and cannot fully accept. Miriam, she said, not any honorific, not any warmth, just my name flat and direct. I waited. This is not how I expected this to go, she said. I know, I said. She looked at me for a moment with something that might, in a different version of events, have resembled respect. You were more prepared than I gave you credit for. My husband prepared me, I said. Something crossed her face that I could not entirely read, too quick and too controlled to name. He had more faith in you than you had in yourself, she said. Whether she intended it as a compliment or simply an observation, I was not certain. What he had, I said, was information. He watched what was happening in his own house, and he made arrangements. The same activity you were engaged in. The difference is that his arrangements were built for me to protect me, not to diminish me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said with a flatness that had nothing performative in it, I never had anyone who did that. Not once in my life. I stood with that. It was not a justification. It was not a reason that changed anything about what she had done. But it was, I believed, the most truthful thing she had ever said to me across all the months I had known her. That absence, I said, did not give you the right to take what I had. She looked at me for a few more seconds. Then she turned and walked away across the parking lot without another word, her heels precise against the pavement, and that was the last time I saw Sandra Calloway. Nathan left the house before the end of the week. He called to tell me he was going not to negotiate or request anything, just to inform me as a courtesy. He said he had arranged for someone to collect what belonged to him and that he would leave everything else undisturbed. He said nothing else, and I did not press him for more. I drove past the house 2 days after he called. The driveway was empty. The house looked like what it had become, a building carefully maintained on the outside, holding nothing of consequence on the inside. I did not stop. I returned a week later when the real estate agent confirmed it was ready to list. I walked through the rooms briefly, not to reclaim them, but to close them properly in my own mind. In the small back room where I had spent those diminished weeks, I found something on the nightstand beside the narrow bed. A small framed photograph. It showed 3 people standing in front of an old car in a parking lot somewhere, all of them squinting into strong afternoon sun. Gerard younger, me younger, and Nathan at perhaps 7 years old, his hair blown sideways by a wind that had ceased to exist decades ago. Nathan had left it there deliberately. He had gone through everything he was taking and had chosen to leave this one thing behind on the nightstand in the room where I had been kept out of sight. I stood for a long time with the photograph in my hands. Whatever that room had been made into, he had placed something real in it at the end. Something that came from before all of this, from the years when things were different. I was not yet ready to decide what that meant or what I would do with it, but I was not willing to leave it behind either. I put it carefully in my bag and carried it out. The house sold in 11 days. I drove north with my car packed with the precision that comes from knowing exactly what matters and what does not. Lake Michigan appeared somewhere outside Muskegon, vast and gray-blue, and entirely indifferent to everything I had been through, which was precisely the quality I needed from it at that moment. The cottage was at the end of a gravel path, modest, solidly built, with a porch facing the water and a kitchen that reminded me of the one Gerard and I had used in our first apartment together. Small, practical, designed for the actual work of feeding people rather than for display. I set my keys on the counter and walked to the window and looked at the lake without speaking, because there was no one to speak to, and that felt exactly right. I stood there for a long time watching the light move on the water, the way Gerard had watched the light move across the yard in those final weeks. He had been memorizing something then. I understood now that I was doing the same thing but differently. I was not memorizing what I was losing. I was memorizing what I had gotten back. In the months after I settled into the cottage, I developed a relationship with the lake that I had not expected and could not entirely explain. I had not sought water when I was looking for a place to go. I had simply needed distance from Columbus, needed to put enough geography between myself and everything that had happened that the habit of anxiety would have time to fade before I encountered it again. The cottage had been available. The price had been manageable given what the trust provided. The photographs had shown a porch facing the water, and I had thought simply that this might be pleasant. What I had not anticipated was what the lake would do to the quality of my mornings. I'd always been an early riser. In the house on Dunbar Road, I had used those early hours for the accumulated small duties of a household coffee and the paper and the particular domestic rhythm that 46 years of marriage builds, without either person quite noticing it being built. In Nathan and Sandra's house, I had used those hours for a different purpose, for the careful vigilance of someone who has understood finally that she needs to pay attention. In the cottage, I used them for nothing. I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the light come up over the water and let my mind move where it wanted without directing it and without accounting for where it went. This was a new practice for me. I had spent my entire adult life being useful, which is a dignified way of saying I had spent my entire adult life being needed, which meant I had spent my entire adult life measuring my mornings against what they were for. The mornings in the cottage were not for anything. They were just mornings. And it took several weeks before I could sit through one without the feeling that I was wasting something. Bet called during the third week. She had been in touch regularly since I moved brief calls that felt less like check-ins and more like a person continuing a conversation that had been temporarily interrupted. She asked how the organization was coming along. She asked about Irene Weston. She asked about the specific procedural details of filing recovery claims, which I answered as best I could, and then she asked how I was doing, meaning not the organization but me. Better, I said, slowly. Are you eating? She asked. I am eating, I said. Good. Gerard would want you to eat. I had to put the phone down for a moment after she said that. Not from grief exactly, though grief was there. From the particular sensation of being known, which I had not experienced in such a plain, uncomplicated form in a long time. Bet knew me the way neighbors know each other imperfectly and through accumulated small observations rather than through any grand revelation. And somehow that imperfect knowledge was exactly what I needed in those early weeks. The organization grew slowly and then quickly the way things grow when they address a need that already exists and has simply been waiting for something to address it. The first year we assisted 12 women in 4 states. The second year the number was closer to 40. Harriet handled the legal architecture with the same precision she had brought to my own case. Betty managed the network of volunteers with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades getting things done through the application of personal energy and stubborn goodwill. Irene, once her own situation was stabilized, became one of our most effective advocates because she understood in her body, rather than just her mind, what it meant to have signed everything and discovered too late what everything meant. I thought sometimes about what Gerard would have made of all of this. He had been a private man, not a secretive one, but private, careful about what he shared with the world and with whom. He had built his business small on purpose because he believed you should only build as much as you could personally stand behind. I thought he might have found the scale of what we were doing slightly uncomfortable, might have preferred something quieter and more contained. But I also thought he would have understood why it needed to be what it was. He had prepared for my specific situation. What the organization was doing was preparing for the same situation in its general form, trying to build the net before people needed it rather than after. One evening in the second spring, sitting on the porch after a long call with a woman in Michigan, whose daughter-in-law had been managing her finances for 3 years without her knowledge, I thought about the night I had stood in the rain outside Nathan's house. I thought about it the way you think about a scar, not with pain, but with a kind of measured recognition. The awareness of something that happened and changed you and that you carry with you forward without it defining everything that comes after. The night had felt like an ending. It had been the opposite. It had been the first night of something I could not have built if I had not first lost what I thought I was building. I did not know then that I would one day sit on a porch in Michigan talking to women I had never met about situations I understood from the inside. I did not know that Gerard's preparations would become the foundation of something larger than either of us had imagined. I did not know that Betty Pruitt would become one of the most important people in my life, or that Irene Weston would find enough of her savings recovered to move into a small apartment in Grand Rapids and send me a photograph of her first real Christmas tree in 2 years, or that the photograph Nathan had left on the nightstand would end up on my kitchen windowsill where I looked at it every morning while the coffee was brewing. I knew none of those things that night in the rain. I knew only that the door had closed and that I was standing on the wrong side of it and that the suitcase in my hand was the whole of what I was working with. It turned out to be enough. Irene Weston's message arrived 3 days after I settled in. She had found my number through means she described only as resourceful, which made me smile properly for the first time in longer than I could calculate. She asked simply how I was doing. I called her back and we talked for the better part of an hour. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I told her the whole of it. From the night in the rain, to the bank, to the courtroom, to the cottage, to the photograph left on the nightstand. And she listened the way only someone who has been through something genuinely comparable can listen, without rushing to offer reassurance, without performing sympathy, just taking in what I was saying and letting it be what it was. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You got out." A lot of women in that exact situation never do. The words stayed with me after the call ended. I sat with them on the porch in the late afternoon with a cup of tea and looked at the lake and thought about what it meant to get out and what it meant that getting out was something worth noting. The Hartley Initiative came together over the following weeks with Harriet's help in the legal architecture and Bet's help with everything else. Bet called the day after I moved north. Her voice had the particular energy of someone who has just made a firm decision and is ready to begin acting on it immediately. "I want to help," she said. "I don't know exactly what shape that takes, but I'm available and I'm angry about what happened, and I'm told that's a useful combination." We built the framework together over separate phone lines with legal pads and more coffee than was medically advisable. An organization focused on financial protection and legal resources for older women facing the particular kind of exploitation that operates behind the face of family care, the kind that is quiet enough to look like love until it is too late to call it anything else. The cases that never make headlines because they do not look dramatic until the damage has already been done and the window for correction has narrowed. Irene became the organization's first client. We helped her file a recovery claim against her nephew. We could not recover everything that had been taken from her, but we recovered enough for her to have meaningful choices again, and meaningful choices are what everything else is constructed from. Daniel's first letter arrived 6 weeks after I moved north. It was handwritten 3 pages on plain unlined paper. He did not explain himself or offer justifications or ask for anything in return. He described what had happened from his own perspective, with the particular specificity of someone who had been spending time with a professional listener and had learned that precise language was not the same as excuse-making, but that it was a necessary part of beginning to understand what you had done and why. He wrote about the moment when things had tilted beyond what he could tell himself was still within the range of reasonable conduct. A specific conversation with Sandra about what the estate would look like once guardianship was formally established, during which he had felt something he could only describe as wrong, and had chosen not to name it or act on it because naming it would have required him to stop. And stopping would have required him to confront what he had already been part of for months. That was the real choice, he wrote, not agreeing to the plan at the beginning. The plan grew slowly enough that I could always find a reason why the next step was still within bounds. The actual choice was that morning when I felt that something was wrong and I looked away from it deliberately. I read that paragraph several times. The second letter came a month later. It was short. He said only that he was still there, not expecting anything in particular, just wanting me to know he had not stopped making the effort to be different than he had been. The third letter arrived at the end of February. The lake outside my window was frozen solid, and the mornings had the particular quality of winter silence, near large bodies of water, a stillness that is not the absence of sound, but a presence of its own, something that asks nothing of you and gives you space to think. Nathan had been in therapy for 3 months and wrote about it in the plain, unself-conscious way of someone who has decided the work is more important than how the work appears to other people. He had been learning, he wrote, to distinguish between being influenced and choosing to be influenced, and to understand that the distinction mattered even when, especially when it was uncomfortable to sit with. The final paragraph of the third letter said this: he had started volunteering with an organization that provided support to older adults who had experienced financial exploitation. He had told them at the outset that he was not a victim, that he was the other category. They had let him in anyway, and he was grateful for that. He wrote that he thought the most genuinely useful thing he could do with what he had learned about himself was to sit across from someone who had made the choices he had made and help them understand what those choices is actually cost the people around them, so that the cost did not have to be paid again by someone else who had not agreed to pay it. He wrote that he was not asking to come back into my life the way it had been before, because he understood that was not possible and would not be fair to ask. He was asking only for the possibility of earning a different kind of place in it, built differently on different terms, if that was ever something I could consider. And if it was not, he understood that too, and he would keep trying to be different regardless. I sat on the porch in my heavy coat and read the letter twice. The lake was pale gray under the winter sky. The gravel path down to the water was crusted with old snow that had frozen and refrozen until it was more ice than snow and caught the afternoon light at a low angle. Then I went inside and found paper and a pen. What I wrote was not long. Length would have suggested I was still working through something I had not resolved, and I had resolved it at least enough to respond honestly. I told him I heard him, that I believed he was genuinely trying and that this mattered even though it could not undo what had happened. I told him that trust was not a thing that could be restored like an object refinished and returned to the same place it had always occupied. Trust that had been broken in the way ours had broken required something different, not restoration, but construction, patient and deliberate, and without any assumption that the new thing would look like the old thing or occupy the same position in either of our lives. I told him I was not closing the door. I told him I was not opening it the way it had once been open. I told him I was leaving it present, neither locked nor flung wide, and that what he did with the time between this letter and whenever we next spoke would tell me more than anything either of us could write. Take care of yourself, Nathan. That is where the rest of it begins. I sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox at the end of the gravel path and let it go into the hands of whatever came next. On the way back, I stopped at the edge of the porch where the planks met the gravel. The lake was still under the late winter light. Inside the cottage, visible through the kitchen window, the small photograph of the three of us sat on the windowsill where I had placed it in the first week. We were all squinting into a sun that had moved to a different angle of the sky long ago. Gerard was there. I was there. Nathan, at 7 years old, was there. His hair blown sideways by a wind that no longer existed in any place that could be visited. I had been thinking lately about the night I stood in the rain outside Nathan's house with my suitcase at my feet and the door closed in front of me. I had stood there long enough for the cold to work its way completely through my coat, long enough to understand in my body rather than just my mind that no door was going to open on its own. At the time, that moment had felt like the final end of something I had spent a lifetime building. I understood now that it had been the first moment of something else entirely. Everything that came after it, every frightening and clarifying and grief-weighted step of it, had given me back something I had been surrendering without fully noticing. My own judgment, my own standing, my own voice, which I had been quietly lowering for months in rooms that did not deserve even the consideration of that lowering. The part of me that Gerard had seen clearly and trusted completely, even when I had lost track of it myself. The blue card was on the kitchen table when I walked back inside, resting beside my coffee mug and a notepad with the day's list written on it in my own handwriting. It was not hidden anymore. It was not precious in the way frightened things are precious, handled carefully because any carelessness might cost everything. It was simply present in the room, the way useful and honest things are present, available without demanding, there when needed, and otherwise just part of the ordinary texture of a life being lived on its own terms. I put my hand on it briefly as I passed. not to pick it up, just to acknowledge it and what it had come from, and the man who had placed it in my path at exactly the moment he had known I would need it. There was a period approximately 2 months after I moved to the cottage when I began to understand that what I had been through had changed not just my circumstances, but my relationship to my own mind. I had spent the better part of a year in a state of managed uncertainty, responding to small pieces of information as they arrived, trying to make sense of things that had been deliberately constructed to resist making sense. The effort of that sustained over months had left something behind. Not trauma exactly, not in the clinical sense, but a particular kind of alertness that did not know how to turn itself off. I noticed it first in small ways. Walking through the cottage in the evenings, I would check that the doors were locked, even though I had already checked them. I would replay conversations in my mind, afterward parsing them for implications I might have missed. I would catch myself noting exits when I entered unfamiliar rooms, a habit that had not existed 6 months earlier, and that I recognized as the residue of a period when leaving unexpectedly had been a necessary skill. These were not debilitating things. They were just things, the texture of a mind that had been through something and had not yet entirely returned to its baseline. I talked about this with a counselor I began seeing in the 4th month, a woman in the small city south of the cottage who worked primarily with older adults and who, had I suspected, heard variations of my story before. She was direct in the way that effective therapists are direct, not unkind, but willing to say the thing rather than approaching it obliquely. She told me that what I was describing was a normal response to an extended period of sustained threat, that the hypervigilance I was experiencing was a system that had been useful and had not yet received the signal that it was no longer needed. How do I send the signal? I asked. You build evidence, she said. Evidence that the environment is different now. Safe routines, predictable patterns, time. The nervous system learns from experience. If the experience is consistently different from what created the vigilance will eventually adjust. Time, I said. Mostly time, she agreed. She was right. The vigilance did adjust gradually over the course of the following months. The door-checking habit faded. The conversation replaying became less habitual. I began to move through the cottage in the evenings without the quiet background calculation that had been running since the night I stood in the rain. I began to trust the quiet rather than hearing threats in it. What remained, what I suspected would remain indefinitely, was a particular quality of attention. An awareness of dynamics that I had not possessed before, or had possessed but had not known how to read. An ability to notice the specific texture of environments where control was being exerted invisibly, where the language of care was being used to carry a different cargo. This was not paranoia, it was knowledge. And knowledge, once you have paid for it at a certain price, does not simply disappear when the situation that required it has passed. It becomes part of what you are available when needed quiet, when not needed present in the background of everything. I found myself using it, this new quality of attention, in the work with the organization. When women called and described their situations, I could hear things in the description that they themselves had not yet recognized as significant. The specific phrasing that Sandra had used, the language of care that carried management inside it, appeared in different forms, in different situations, but the structure was recognizable once you knew what you were looking for. The way control established itself through small generosities, the way the person being controlled was persuaded to be grateful for their own diminishment, the way questions were discouraged without ever being explicitly forbidden through the accumulated atmosphere of a household where asking questions had consequences. I could hear these patterns because I had lived inside them. And hearing them, I could ask the specific questions that helped other women hear them too, not tell them what they were experiencing, but reflect it back in language that made the shape of it visible. This was, I came to understand, the particular kind of usefulness that came from having been through something rather than simply knowing about it from a distance. The difference between theory and experience. The difference between understanding something and having paid for that understanding at a price you would not have chosen but could not now return. The real estate agent who handled the sale of Nathan and Sandra's house was a woman named Connie, efficient and kind in the particular way of professionals who deal regularly with people in transition. She asked minimal questions about my reasons for selling and focused on the practical details with a brisk competence I appreciated. When she told me the house had 3 offers within a week, all above asking price, I felt nothing in particular about it. The house had been a setting for something. Now the setting would belong to someone else, and they would make of it whatever they made of things. I was in the cottage by the time the sale closed. Harriet handled the final documents through the mail. The proceeds went directly into the trust, which was already more than sufficient for everything I would need, but which I had decided to build into something more useful than a personal reserve. Gerard had prepared for my situation. What I was building was preparation for the situation in general, the version of it that was happening in 100 other families in 100 other cities at that exact moment, quietly and invisibly, and mostly without any plan in place to address it. The legal structure of the Hartley Initiative took 3 months to complete properly. Harriet was meticulous about the nonprofit designation, the board structure, the conflict of interest provisions, the financial oversight requirements. She had seen enough of what happened when organizations built to protect people were themselves poorly governed to understand that the architecture mattered as much as the intention. I sat through long phone calls about bylaws and reporting requirements and grant eligibility with the patience of someone who understood that the tedious parts were what made the important parts possible. Bet drove up from Columbus twice that first year to help with outreach and intake procedures. She had retired from her career as a high school librarian the previous spring and had arrived at volunteerism with the same energetic competence she brought to everything else. She knew how to talk to people who were frightened without making them feel managed. She knew how to listen in the way that made people feel heard rather than processed. She was, it turned out, exactly the right person for this particular work. And I told her so directly because I had learned in the preceding year that the time for indirection was over. You spent 40 years being exactly this kind of useful, she said when I told her. You just didn't know it yet. I thought about that for a long time after she said it. I had spent 40 years being useful to a family, to a household, to a marriage. I had not thought of that as a transferable skill, exactly more as a mode of being that was specific to that particular context. But Bet was right that the underlying capacity was the same. The ability to organize complexity, to hold multiple needs in mind simultaneously, to understand what people required without always waiting for them to ask. These were things I had been doing for 4 decades without naming them or crediting myself for them because they had seemed too ordinary to deserve credit. They were not ordinary. They were, it turned out, exactly what this work required. The photograph on the kitchen windowsill changed over time in what it meant to me. In the first weeks, I could barely look at it. In the months that followed, I looked at it often, but carefully the way you look at something that holds more than one kind of feeling, and you are not yet sure which feeling will be strongest on any given day. By the end of the first year, I could look at it simply as what it was, a record of a time when 3 people occupied the same life with uncomplicated affection before the various complications arrived. The complications did not erase the time that came before them. That was something I had to learn, that the existence of betrayal later does not retroactively hollow out the years when there was no betrayal. Both things were true simultaneously. I had been loved by this person. I had been failed by this person. These were not contradictions that resolved into one thing. They were the full picture held together. Nathan and I spoke for the first time by phone in the summer after the hearing, 8 months after I had moved to the cottage. He called on a Sunday morning and I answered because I had decided at some point in the weeks before that I was ready for the conversation and was simply waiting for him to be ready too. We talked for 40 minutes. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not explain himself further than he already had in the letters. He asked about the organization, and I told him about it, and he listened in the way that people listen when they are genuinely interested rather than looking for an opening to say something else. At the end of the call, he said he was glad I was doing well. I said I was glad he was getting better. We left it there, and it was the right place to leave it. There would be more conversations. I did not know yet what they would contain or where they would lead, but I had stopped believing that the future was determined by the past, which was, I thought, one of the more significant things the preceding year had taught me. The past was real and its consequences were real, and they did not disappear because you would prefer them to. But they also did not own the future. The future was made of choices, each one its own moment, each one belonging to whoever was making it at the time. I had learned to make different choices than the ones I had been making. Perhaps Nathan was learning the same thing. Time would tell, and time was something I had which was itself a gift I had not expected to unwrap at 68 years old. Gerard had known. He had known me well enough to understand that I would need to be pushed rather than guided, that I would not act on a vague sense of wrongness, but would act decisively when the evidence was undeniable. He had assembled the evidence. He had put it in a place I could find it. He had trusted me to do the rest, which was the most complete expression of trust he could have offered. The kind that does not hover or supervise, but simply creates the conditions and then lets the other person be who they are. I missed him every day. That did not diminish. But the quality of the missing changed from the raw, indiscriminate missing of the first weeks to something more specific and more bearable. The missing of a particular person who had been particular in ways I continued to find and understand even in his absence. He had left his thinking behind in the structure of what he had built. I kept finding new rooms in it, new evidence of how thoroughly he had considered the situation, new small decisions that revealed something about how he had seen me and what he had believed I was capable of. He had believed I was capable of all of it, not just surviving it, but turning it into something. That belief, expressed in the architecture of a trust rather than in words, was one of the most significant things anyone had ever said to me, and I intended to spend the rest of my life being worthy of it. Then I poured more coffee and sat down at the table and picked up the phone to return a call from a woman in Cincinnati who had left a message 2 days earlier. She had spoken carefully and quietly, choosing her words the way people choose words when they are not yet certain whether what they are describing is serious enough to name out loud to someone else. When she answered, her voice carried the particular uncertainty of someone standing at the beginning of something they do not yet have a name for. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I'm not sure I'm in any real trouble, but something has been feeling wrong for a while now and I didn't know who else to call." "I know that feeling exactly," I said. "Tell me what's been happening." Outside the window, the lake shifted slightly in the late afternoon wind, gray and wide and patient, in the way that large bodies of water are patient, indifferent to human timelines, and entirely reliable in their own. The light came in at the low angle of late winter, clear and unhurried, without any urgency about where it was going or how long it had. I settled into my chair and held the phone and listened, and the room was warm, and the coffee was strong, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was as precisely as I could understand such things, the life I had fought my way back to, built again on ground that was entirely my own, in a house where every room held space that no one else had any claim over. And I intended to keep it.